It's been 2 months since we left our jobs, moved back to our old house, and started the work of building a micro flower farm. The name of the game right now is renovation. And while I would have loved to have gotten started earlier, if you've been following our journey toward the end of last year, you know that simply was not a possibility. Winter is not the ideal time to be doing outdoor construction projects and landscaping, but we need to get our farm off the ground so that we can start making some income from it. So we have been hauling booty, getting things ready, and I wanted to take a video to share with you some of the stuff that we've been up to. And by the way, welcome back to the channel if you're new here. I'm Taylor, and in case you missed it, my wife, 3 kids, and I are starting a small flower farm on our suburban lot. And we're trying to do it as we always start gardening projects, by spending as little money as possible, which coincidentally prioritizes sustainability and regenerative growing practices. So I'll be highlighting some of those as we walk through what we're doing. And just a heads up, this is not going to be a glamorous farm tour. The projects that we've been up to so far largely fall into the clearing the land category, where we're setting yourselves up for success in the long run. And as far as clearing the land, that's mostly consisted of removing some trees, cleaning up trash, and piling up yard debris. We live on 0.38 acres, and we're planning on using 1/10 of an acre for flower production, which doesn't seem like a whole lot, but all of the advice that we've ever received in the world of farming tells us to start small. That said, to find that space, it's required us to remove 4.5 trees on our property to be able to bring in more sunlight. As I mentioned before, we're on a pretty tight budget, so we're doing a lot of this work ourselves. That said, for our tree removal, we're lucky to have my dad's years of tree service experience to help with this. So we chopped down a few spruces in the front yard. Still have some work to do to process the lumber and finish chopping the trees down to stump height, but we can already see how much more sunlight is actually going to be able to enter the front yard and make that space viable for growing. In the backyard, we removed a crabapple and the largest cherry tree that I've ever seen. It was sad on the one hand to see it go, but on the other hand, the cherries are like all out of reach. The tree wasn't really the healthiest. The shade it was producing was blocking probably a few hundred square feet worth of growing space from receiving proper light. And the tree itself was planted right in the middle of a planned garden bed, so we took it down. We've got 2 more enormous ponderosa pines residing in our property, one in the front yard and one in the back. We were planning on getting the backyard pine removed by a professional, but after getting a quote of $5,500 on the low end, we decided that that space that we would recover by removing it would not be worth the cost. Besides, the tree is pretty healthy and the branches are limbed high enough that it doesn't actually cast that much shade on otherwise viable growing space. Back to the front yard, if you caught our video asking the question, should you cover your yard with wood chips, you know that we ultimately decided that we needed to scrape the wood chips off of the soil surface in order to amend the soil and form garden beds. And scraping 5-year-old wood chips off the ground is about as exciting as it sounds. Cassidy has taken lead on this project and is probably about a half of the way done at the time of recording this video, so who knows, she might have finished it by the time this goes live. The plan here is to do a proper compaction soil test and then to do a one-time till to get the soil established. If we do that, we'll probably just be tilling in some compost and biochar and maybe a few of our other homemade gardening amendments. On the flip side, if we can get away without tilling, we'll be able to avoid reawakening dormant weed seeds in the lower layers of the soil. But if it comes down to fighting compaction or dealing with weeds, we'd really rather deal with weeds. For the wood chips we're scraping off, we will probably just feed that to our chicken coop to be processed and prepared for composting, which we'll touch on a little bit later in this video. The last main component of clearing and cleaning the land has been trash removal. Our renters who lived here before us went a little crazy toward the end, and from what we can tell, they just started burning trash in the backyard and then smothering it with wood chips and pine needles. So we've had to bag up the melted plastic and metal cans and other burned bits that have been left in various piles and chunks around the backyard. We had to take 3 massive trailer loads of trash that they left behind to the dump when we first moved back, and since then we've been slowly accumulating and collecting the remaining bits from around the property. So pretty soon here we'll probably be able to do one final dump run and get rid of the rest of that trash. And this whole process of clearing the land is something that we almost always recommend that gardeners start with before installing new garden beds. It really helps to just kind of get to the point where you can see everything. And I know that it sounds really obvious or simple, but it's really important for a number of reasons. Tracking sunlight, as I mentioned before, but also just kind of getting to the point where you can fully observe the land that you're trying to grow on. most likely, and especially if you're trying to grow in a suburban lot like this, if you're breaking new ground for a larger growing space, you're gonna have infrastructure and debris, natural or man-made, that you gotta deal with. A piece of infrastructure that we're taking the time to deal with right now is our irrigation, and we are super lucky to have already sort of have a sprinkler system pre-installed when we first bought the house 6.5 years ago. That said, a number of things have kept us from using it, namely broken sprinkler heads and leaky pipes. So for the sake of doing it right for the first time and not fighting it later on, we decided to dig it up by hand, and it's really quite extensive. It's not the most convenient or aesthetically pleasing thing to just have lying around on our property, but we wanted to have it all dug up before potentially tilling, before installing some of our other infrastructure, before budgeting for repairs and forming all of our garden beds, because the fact is this thing is old and we didn't know where it even really was. Most of the sprinkler heads had long been buried or removed. So somehow we're going to repair this and add pipe and retrofit it back into the property before we start planting in the spring. To be honest, it is a huge unknown for right now. The last major piece of infrastructure that we're addressing is, as you may have guessed from the thumbnail of this video, the greenhouse slash chicken coop. The greenhouse, like the irrigation system, was here when we first bought the home. And sometime into our second year living here, the first time, we converted 1/3 of it to be a chicken coop. The part right behind me. Chickens sit at the center of our gardening philosophy. They're kind of a no-brainer for us when it comes to making compost for the garden and of course supplying eggs. The problem with having our chicken coop here is that it breaks up the flow of our garden beds where we want to put them, and it isn't really the most convenient location for being able to bring them material to process and then remove to compost. Chickens are excellent pre-compost makers in that they look at a pile of leaves or straw or wood chips, and then they just assume that there are bugs hiding in there. So they shred up the materials looking for said bugs and poop on them, which makes them just really easy to rake the chicken bedding back out of the coop and pile it up to make a hot compost pile that's then ready to use in the garden in a month. Thing is, with having our chicken coop so far back on our property, it's a bit tedious having to lug back carbon-rich material for their bedding and then compost it and lug it back to the whole rest of the yard to spread it. Instead, we wanted to have it in a more central location so that we didn't have to move materials so many times before ending up in the garden. And we wanted it to be easy to deliver the materials. So the best location that we could think of was the space right at the end of our pseudo lower driveway, where we've gotten manure deliveries and brought bags of leaves from the neighbors in the past. That said, a greenhouse is quite a large thing to move, so I'm deconstructing it and preparing to put it back together down there, with a few key changes. And we'll showcase this in a video a little bit later on this year, so stay tuned for that. But that's gonna give the engine of the farm a more central and integrated location that'll make everything just a bit more convenient. And speaking of compost, we are following the cardinal rule, the ABCs of gardening: always be composting and preparing our compost needs for the upcoming growing season. Compost is just one of those things that's hard to do without. There are a lot of ways that you can reduce your needs for it, but it's always good to have a pile brewing. We've got a big one rocking right now to supply a bit of bulk organic matter, but we need a little over a dozen yards of compost for this farm. We'll be remediating and building soil using some spring cover crops as well, but compost is just such a good source of all-purpose biology for our garden and supplies food for the microorganisms in the soil to eat and multiply. And of course, we'll be heavily reliant on our indigenous microorganisms, IMO5, that we've got. I'll be making more IMO4 in the spring when temps get a bit warmer. Truthfully, this has been a very mild winter for us here in Eastern Washington. I know that the rest of the country has been experiencing something a little different. For us, we've barely got any snow, and temps have not dropped much below the teens at the coldest, and for the most part, it's been in like the mid-30s during the days and low 30s at night, which is super nice with all of the work that we're trying to do. As far as installing our garden row beds, we're waiting to get the chicken coop moved and the remainder of the cherry tree removed. The cherry wood I found insanely hard, so if you have any experience removing a cherry stump of that size or something similar, please drop your advice in the comments and I'd be grateful. I'm also wondering how a stump grinder is gonna fare once I do get it chopped down to the base, but once that's done and once we've got wood chips scraped off of the front yard, we're going to be able to get started digging out pathways and mounding our 4-foot wide garden beds. I have had the chance to mostly set up one of our veggie patches, and this is actually a decent amount of space. These beds are 4 feet wide and 11 or 12 feet long, so I've got a good 150 to 200 square feet of growing space. We'll reserve a little bit more space probably in the front yard for some more veggies, but for back here, I set up these beds as hugelkultur style beds, which gave me a great use for the lumber that we accumulated. And the last step before mulching and planting into these is just setting up some sort of retainer for each bed. The slope here is a little bit of a steeper grade than I imagined when I was eyeballing it, but now that the garden beds are formed, I can see that I'm definitely going to need a way to keep the soil from sliding down the hill. Other than getting the growing space ready itself, we have been putting in a good amount of hours into seed starting. And this is largely Cassidy's arena. My role in seed starting is mostly with regards to preparing the materials for our potting mix. But she's been starting seeds most days, either in the early morning or late at night. She has started somewhere around 4,370 seeds already, and we aren't even really into our real seed starting yet. These are just the early cold hardy flowers that we'll be planting out in April, and some that just take a really long time to germinate. Plus, we've got our winter sown perennial flowers and some veggies. It's a lot. And that is just about gonna wrap up this unfinished farm tour. Building something on this scale while raising 3 kids, none of whom are in school yet, is quite the task. It's very slow going. Feels like we work on something without seeing any progress, and then a few weeks pass by and we realize, whoa, we're getting closer, I think. The main overarching goal is to set ourselves up for the growing season so that we don't have to be fighting infrastructure issues and system failures while we're planting out hundreds of plants every day and harvesting thousands every week. If you're able, please share in the comments about your garden projects that you're up to now and or your dreams for this coming growing season. If you need help getting started, you can use our free simple garden planning roadmap linked in the description or scan the code on the screen. And if this video opened a loop in your brain about whether or not you should spread wood chips across your front yard to build soil passively, you might want to check out our video attempting to answer that question next. Thank you for watching, and as always, we'll see you in the next one.